Now, Donald Trump is widening his threats across Latin America, warning that any country linked to the drugs trade could be subject to attack. The US president's comments came as his country maintains a significant military presence in the Caribbean and as the White House ramps up its warnings to Venezuela. So what is Trump actually gearing up for? And how likely is military action against Venezuela aimed at regime change?
Fighter jets, transport planes, support helicopters, part of the military buildup at a U.S. base in Puerto Rico within striking distance of Venezuela. 15,000 U.S. soldiers are now stationed in the region. There are also at least 11 U.S. naval vessels in the area, including the United States' largest aircraft carrier, which can carry dozens of planes. Even tiny Tobago has agreed to host a U.S. military radar installation. Trump has authorized covert intelligence operations in Venezuela and threatened airstrikes on alleged drug cartels there. Sources say that during a call he told Venezuela's president to leave the country. On social media, Trump warned that the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela is to be closed in its entirety. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has remained defiant.
We want peace, but peace with sovereignty, peace with equality, peace with freedom. We do not want a slave's peace or the peace of colonies.
Maduro has ruled Venezuela for 12 years, and the U.S. and dozens of other countries don't accept the results of the last two elections that kept him in power. Opinions in Caracas are mixed.
Obviously, we do not agree with violence and an armed invasion. But I think that both sides must reach an agreement and provide a way out for the significant part of the Venezuelan population that is calling for change.
Calling for violence cannot be the solution. How long will that last? We will become a protectorate of the United States. We already know the history of U.S. invasions. I'm telling you this as a historian.
Actually invading Venezuela would require far more troops than the U.S. has in place and could lead to chaos. But that hasn't stopped Trump from threatening other countries in the region as well.
I hear Colombia, the country of Colombia, is making cocaine. They have cocaine manufacturing plants, okay? And then they sell us the cocaine. We appreciate that very much. But yeah, anybody that's doing that and selling it into our country is subject to attack.
Trump came to office promising an end to wars in far-off countries, and polls show little support in the U.S. for attacking Venezuela. But Trump keeps escalating his rhetoric and the military buildup in the Caribbean. That could make it harder to find an off-ramp from a conflict few people seem to want.
Well, let's explore this with my next two guests who have taken differing views on what the United States should do about Venezuela and how the US should achieve its objectives. Ellen Knickmeyer is one of the most experienced reporters on the ground-level consequences of US military intervention. She argues in Foreign Policy magazine that the same overconfidence that drove the Iraq war now threatens to push Washington towards another disastrous intervention. Elliot Abrams served as the US Special Representative for Venezuela in the first Trump administration. He argues in Foreign Affairs that the US should pursue outright regime change against Nicolas Maduro. So welcome both. And let's start with you, Elliot Abrams. Why do you believe the United States should be meddling in the affairs of a sovereign foreign country?
First, Venezuela had a free election, and by every account, every NGO, every government, it was won in a landslide by Edmundo Gonzalez. Nicolas Maduro lost, yet he won't leave power, so he should be forced to leave power. While he's in power, Venezuela is a force for instability in the whole region. A fourth of the population, about 8 million Venezuelans, have had to flee their own country. As long as Maduro is there, that will continue, and it destabilizes all of the countries that are nearby Venezuela. Venezuela is also a source of cocaine trafficking, of Colombian cocaine. with the cooperation of many in the regime and the military, and that should stop.
And so just so we're clear, should the US intervene in every country whose election results it doesn't like?
It's not a matter of not liking. We like the election results. Nicolas Maduro lost in a landslide, but he is forcing his way to remain in power.
So not a question of like, but should the US intervene everywhere where it believes that justice has not been done? That's a yes or a no, and then we can go to Ellen.
No, of course not.
OK. Ellen Knickmeyer, we can get into whether or not the US could actually pull this off in a moment. First, let's start with the legitimacy of this course of action.
You know, as a reporter, I'm not an advocate. I just wrote about. I thought it was worth reminding people of the track record that the U.S. has to study of past regime efforts, and in the instance of Venezuela, reminding that in general that like. Even a quick military victory that deposes a foreign leader, that's a different thing from long-term dealing with the problems, known and unknown, that that leader left behind. OK, so we'll go to Elliot Abrams and talk about how the US, he believes the US should do this. And then we'll come back to you and talk about the US history of victories and or otherwise. So, Elliot Abrams, how should the United States get rid of Nicolas Maduro? Are you talking about a US invasion?
No, and I think this president will never do that. You know, he ran against that kind of thing. We tried diplomatic and economic pressure in the first Trump term. It didn't work. And he's adding military pressure now. The pressure he's using now is more of psychological operation, I think, than real. But it's pretty clear, it's not certain, but it's pretty clear that the next step is to be hitting targets inside Venezuela, with the hope that that leads the regime to crack, or that it leads the military to rise up against Maduro. That's not certain at all. I guess I'm a little more optimistic than Ellen Knickmeyer that because this is South America, which with the exception of Venezuela is democratic, and remembering that democratic Venezuela lasted for 50 years after they overthrew a military dictator in 1958, Venezuela has a good chance, or better chance, I think, of having this work.
OK, so if I can summarize that crudely, the United States launches bombs at Venezuela, crosses its fingers and hopes that the military takes over. Ellen Knickmeyer, from your reporting on Iraq and other US interventions, give us an overview of what history tells us about what happens inside of regime security apparatus when America starts dropping bombs on them.
Right. I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy looking at, you know, kind of my experience, particularly in Iraq, when I was on the ground for the really rather quick U.S. overthrow of Saddam Hussein. And I was still on the ground many years later covering U.S. troops still struggling to come to terms with, you know, picking up the bodies of the victims of sectarian killings that had in a sectarian war that had been unleashed unforeseen by the invasion, the U.S. forces dealing with an empowered Islamic State and empowered Iran, you know, that also were unforeseen by the U.S. consequences of the U.S. invasion. And for a recent piece I did for Foreign Policy, I talked to academics who kind of run the spreadsheets on the U.S. history of foreign regime change. And, you know, there's a lot of data drawn because the U.S. is the world's leader in regime change. And just as far as airstrikes go, academics, including Alex Downs and Lindsay O'Rourke, say that they haven't found an instance where airstrikes alone were enough to overthrow a leader. And in general, their findings and that of other academics was that, you know, military overthrows of a foreign leader by a foreign power often lead to more violence and seldom lead to democracy, more democracy.
What about that, Elliot? Unforeseen consequences, sectarian war amongst them. What makes you so sure that the Venezuelan military elites would fracture rather than harden against the American aggressor?
Well, this is not Libya, this is not Iraq, this is not Syria. That kind of sectarian violence requires that there be sects, Druze, Shia, Sunni, Kurds. That's not Venezuela. That's not South America. Those kinds of social and religious divisions don't exist. In fact, the record of the democratization of South America since the 1980s is very good, and none of the countries has really gone back to being a military dictatorship. I think you're absolutely right that this may not work. That is, if the Trump plan is, as I think it is, that kind of pressure on the Venezuelan regime and military, what do they do if, a week goes by, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and it hasn't worked? Do they escalate? Do they add to the target list? I don't know the answer to that, but I hope they've thought it through.
Okay, there is a lot of fingers crossing going on here. Ellen Knickmeyer, Elliot Abrams argues in his piece that not intervening in Venezuela poses a greater national security risk to the US. He talks about growing Russian, Chinese, Iranian and Cuban influence there. How risky do you consider those risks to be?
If I could go back to one thing Mr. Abrams said, which was about Venezuela not having the sectarian violence that Libya, the sectarian divisions that Libya and Iraq have. When you overthrow a leader, you create a security vacuum and a power struggle, and both of those things can show you divides or exaggerate divides in society that you may not have realized were there or were going to be that much of a problem. So those things tend, a military overthrow and a security vacuum tend to bring out the problems, not all of them foreseen.
Okay, more unforeseen consequences.
Right. In terms of
the threat from Russia, China, Iran and Cuba.
Right. Mr. Abrams mentioned, the need to deal with Russia and China and possibly Iran. They're still going to be there, presumably, even if Maduro's gone. And, as we saw in Iran and other places, including Libya, foreign powers, they don't stop interfering. They actually tended to, in the cases I saw, increase their interference. I don't think that, if Russia's a problem now, it's not going to say, well, tell the U.S., good job, you've won here, we'll move on.
So a quick response to that, Elliot.
Yeah, Venezuela has had an election. They've got a Democratic president in waiting, in exile today. When he becomes president, he can say to Iran and to Russia, we don't want your kind of help that you gave to the old Maduro regime. We want to be a democratic government such as exists in the rest of South America. And I don't think, I hope I'm right, I don't think that the examples that come from faraway, very different countries with zero democratic history, like Iraq or Libya, really tell you much about South America.
All right, good talking to you. Thank you both. You've given us a lot to think about. Former Special Envoy to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, journalist Ellen Knickmeyer. Thank you both.
Thank you.